Hello everyone, thank you all for coming today for our press conference for the Philippine Human Rights Act. Today we will be joined by our champion, Representative Susan Wild, as well as our community members and supporters of this legislation. First off, to introduce myself, my name is Ives Ibungco. I'm the National Chairperson of the Malaya Movement USA. We're a movement formed in 2018 in response to the human rights crisis in the Philippines as a result of the Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs and crackdown against human rights defenders. Back in 2020, the Malaya Movement USA, the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, or ICHRP USA, Kabataan Alliance, and various organizations came together to launch the campaign for the Philippine Human Rights Act. And in September of 2020, Pennsylvania Representative Susan Wild formally introduced the bill. The Philippine Human Rights Act aims to suspend the provision of security assistance to the Philippines until such time that the government of the Philippines has made certain reforms to the military and police force. Since its introduction, the PHRA has been gaining support around the country. As we speak, more than 200 organizations and institutions have endorsed the PHRA. Yesterday, vigils across the country, in more than 20 cities across the United States, vigils were held by our community members and supporters to highlight the urgency and growing clamor for our representatives to stand with the Filipino people and end the support for the Duterte regime. Today is a momentous day as we celebrate Filipino-American History Month. What better way to celebrate Filipino-American History Month than by continuing to make history as we call for the passage of the Philippine Human Rights Act. That is why today I am proud to introduce our champion, Pennsylvania Representative Susan Wild. Congresswoman Wild was elected as the first woman to represent Pennsylvania's 7th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. Congresswoman Wild has been appointed to the House Education and Labor Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Representative Susan Wild has been our champion and has consistently led the charge for the introduction of the Philippine Human Rights Act. Without further ado, Representative Susan Wild.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this gorgeous day. I'm really happy to be here with all of you to mark these days of action in support of the Human Rights Act. Today is about the human rights activists who are gathered here and across the country, who have been working tirelessly alongside their brothers and sisters in the Philippines to bring about a future of equal rights, dignity, and justice for all. Today is about the labor organizers and the leaders who have been standing with the Filipino labor movement for years, supporting the movement's fight for decent wages and working conditions and against the brutal repression of the Duterte regime. Today is about an extraordinary international movement that has risen up to say no to the horrific attacks of the Duterte regime against dissidents, labor organizers, members of the clergy, journalists, opposition leaders, and so many more innocent people. We've gathered here in October because this month is Filipino-American History Month. And as we reflect on the proud heritage of Filipino Americans and their irreplaceable contributions to our nation, we must also face the often tragic history of the United States-Philippines relationship. To continue to aid yet another repressive regime in the Philippines would be to continue this tragic history. Instead, in our time, we have the opportunity to place the United States on the right side of history. We have the opportunity to rise to the occasion and finally adopt a policy toward the Philippines that is anchored in respect and dignity for the rights of the people of the Philippines. As a sponsor of the Philippines Human Rights Act in Congress, I am deeply inspired by the grassroots mobilization that has been taking place taxpayer funds should not be used to supply weapons to a regime that violently targets its political opponents, including a United States citizen, Brandon Lee, a human rights activist who was shot by state security forces in 2019 and remains paralyzed from the chest down today as a result of that attack. Brandon deserves to know that his government stands with him, not with his attackers. I have made this point to the Trump administration, and now I am making it to the Biden administration. If we in the United States are going to say that we stand for human rights around the world, then we need to stand for human rights around the world. Not just where it's politically convenient, not just where it's easy. That's why when the current administration notified Congress of its intent to try to sell more than $2 billion worth of weapons and equipment to the Philippines, I objected. And I'm going to keep doing everything within my power to stop those sales from going through. Because no amount of defense contracts will ever match the values of a human life. Is it too much to ask that our government stop arming an authoritarian regime waging war on its people? Is it too much to ask for our government to side with workers and the labor movement, both here at home and around the world? If I have one message for all of those who defend the status quo on this issue, all of those who claim that we effectively need to choose between our security and our principles, it's this: it doesn't need to be this way. Abdicating our values makes us less secure in the long run. It's long past time for us to have a policy towards the Philippines that is based on our shared humanity. Solidarity, that's what you're fighting for. That's what I'm fighting for. Together with the labor movement, together with all of those who advocate for fundamental human rights. Let's keep organizing. Let's keep mobilizing. Let's keep moving the struggle forward. Thank you, everyone. Woo! Woo!
Thank you so much, Representative Susan Wild. Our next speaker is from the National Church of Christ, Kim Winkler. Kim Winkler was elected as President and General Secretary of the National Church of Christ. The NCC is an ecumenical partnership of 38 Christian faith groups in the United States. Its member denominations, churches, conventions, and archdioceses include Protestant, Anglican, Orthodox, Evangelical, historic African American, and living peace traditions, in a common commitment to advocate and represent God's love and promise of unity in our public square. As President and General Secretary, Mr. Winkler is the public voice of the NCC and represents the Council as it addresses its major priorities, such as mass incarceration and interreligious relationships, with a focus on peace. So our next speaker, Jimmy.
Thank you very much. I want to begin by thanking Representative Susan Wild for hosting this press conference in which we honor the thousands of lives lost on the regime in the Philippines, and also to promote the passage of the Philippine Human Rights Act. This press conference kicks off a National Day of Action. Filipino organizations and allies will be hosting vigils across the country in Portland, Seattle, Northern and Southern California, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Chicago, and elsewhere, bringing attention to the human rights situation in the Philippines. First and foremost, I want you to know the National Council of Churches in the United States stands with the National Council of Churches in the Philippines as they and many others face the Duterte government's practice of red tagging, that is, targeting of church leaders and human rights activists for standing up for social justice and opposing human rights abuses. Many of our member churches have direct links with churches in the Philippines, so this is really a very personal matter for our churches. And for me, I was involved in the effort to bring an end to the Marcos regime, and I'm so disappointed that here we are again with many of the same issues at stake. And here we gather a few feet away from where a mob stormed the Capitol of the United States only 9 months ago, an attempt to to overturn a free and fair election and murder senior elected officials, including the Vice President of the United States. We are in the midst of a constitutional crisis in this nation, and so too the Philippines faces a constitutional crisis, and like ours, it was planned by the President of the nation. Permit me to read a paragraph from the letter sent to members in Congress this morning. Bishops, priests, retired pastors, women religious, church leaders, church workers, and laity in the Philippines have been threatened, intimidated, harassed, and murdered for speaking out against the extrajudicial killings and the war on drugs. President Duterte has threatened to kill useless bishops, as he said, who speak out against his infamous drug war, a war which has been widely condemned as cruel and unjust, a killing spree without due process. The armed forces of the Philippines recently concluded the National Council of Churches of the Philippines, the largest Protestant group in the country, is a part of a list of organizations it described as communist terrorist groups. This is a lie. Shame on the political and military leadership of the Philippines for these nefarious acts. Let me conclude by pointing out that the success and durability of our own democracy depends not only on facing down the mob and the forces that attempt to destroy our government here, but on stopping those same forces everywhere. That is why we want to see passage of the Philippines Human Rights Act. Thank you.
Thank you again so much, Jim Winkler of the National Council of Churches. Our next speaker is from the Communication Workers of America, Elena Lopez. Elena Lopez is a legislative associate with the Communications Workers of America, a labor union representing over 700,000 members across the country. CWA is committed to battling against the sorts of egregious labor and human rights abuses that are the reality facing the Filipino people under the Duterte regime.
Good afternoon, brothers, sisters, and siblings. Thank you all for being here. My name is Elena Lopez, and I'm here on behalf of the Communication Workers of America, CWA. First, I would like to thank Congresswoman Susan Wild for her amazing leadership on introducing and advocating for the passage of the Philippine Human Rights Act. She understands that all of us, especially those in the labor movement, cannot fight for our own dignity and rights here without helping our brothers and sisters abroad. As we reflect on and celebrate Filipino American History Month, we must remember and fight for the working people who continue to suffer under the brutality of the Duterte regime. We have heard stories from our friends and allies in the Philippines about the increased persecution, red tagging, and attacks on labor activists and human rights defenders. Many of you know CWA's involvement in this fight. When our members were on strike in Verizon in 2016, Filipino workers reached out to us to help us in our fight because Verizon brought in folks from our striking call centers to them. Then a delegation of our members went to the Philippines to speak with call center workers and learned about the terrible conditions they face and their fight to improve their lives. Since then, our union has continued to work in solidarity with the Filipino community here and in the Philippines to speak out against the atrocities of the Duterte regime. In March of this year, we saw the armed forces of the Philippines and the Philippines National Police carry out a series of joint operations that led to the murder of 9 activists and arrest of 6 others. The victims were members of progressive organizations that advocated around labor, indigenous rights, and environmental protections. Unfortunately, these devastating losses are far too common. Across the country, individuals are being held to bring attention to the thousands of lives lost under the Duterte regime. It is morally reprehensible that our tax dollars are used to support a regime that views activists the same as terrorists. The Duterte administration's use of the anti-terrorism law has not only led to chilling effect on the work of labor activists and human rights defenders, but it has also led to the imprisonment and execution of many.
We, as part of a global labor movement, cannot stand idly by while Duterte kills activists one by one. We must condemn it and do everything in our power to stop it. That starts with legislation like the Philippine Human Rights Act. We call on Congress to pass the PHRA and end our support for the Duterte regime. All of us, especially those of us in the labor movement, cannot fight for our own dignity and respect here without standing with our brothers and sisters abroad. TWA is proud to be in this fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elena. For our last speaker, representing Filipino youth and students, Michaela Taho. Michaela Taho is a student at the George Washington University and the advocacy director of George Washington's Philippine Cultural Society. Born in the Philippines, Michaela is passionate about the topics of human rights and racial justice in the United States and in the Philippines.
Woo! Woo! Woo!
Thank you for the introduction, Yves Luboco. Thank you again, Representative Susan Wild, for all the leadership and support you had for the Philippines Human Rights Act. My name is Michaela Taho. I am a student of the George Washington University's Philippine Cultural Society, a member of the National Alliance of Filipino Youth and Student Organizations, Kabataan Alliance. October is an important month for the Philippine Cultural Society, as it is for Filipino Americans across the country. October is a time when Filipino American students like me celebrate our culture loudly and proudly throughout our campus. We host Filipino show watch parties. We eat Filipino food. But this month means more than that. October commemorates the arrival of the first Filipinos in the United States, who were brought to California back in 1587. Since then, we've become famous for bringing nurses and fried delicious foods. But we also bring a history of resistance, of calling out injustice, of advocating for human rights in the Philippines and in the United States. In its early days, members of the Philippine Cultural Society would participate in song and dance to raise awareness against the Marcos dictatorship. They would host vigils to mourn political prisoners and lives lost under that regime. Today's Philippine Cultural Society honors and continues that legacy. We see the human rights abuses currently going on in the Philippines. We've seen the indigenous Lumad youth denied education. We've seen them leave their ancestral homes because of militarization. We've seen the senseless deaths of young people like Yandel Santos, young people like us, killed in the so-called drug war, really a war on the poor. Yandel Santos was 17 years old. He was younger than me. Filipino youth have seen far too much. This is why the Philippine Cultural Society, a proud member of Kabataan Alliance, an original sponsor of this bill, decided to endorse the Philippine Human Rights Act. We were created to be active, created to be political. So if not us, then who? Lives are at stake with this bill. How could we sit idly? And we are encouraging all who are listening today to follow suit. We are calling on Filipino American youth to honor the political history of student organizations by educating and learning, uniting and taking action. We are calling on legislators to become a sponsor. And most of all, with our resistance to Marcos and now to Duterte, we are calling to pass the Philippine Human Rights Act now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're now open for questions.
Hi, I have a question for Representative Wild. Hi, Rep. Wild. I'm Kat. I'm with Katarungan. My question is, how do you respond to those who say we shouldn't end aid to the Philippines due to the military relationship to the Philippines in proximity to China?
Thank you for the question. This is what is most often cited as the reason for our military assistance to the Philippines. It's a matter, we are told, of national security, of proximity to China. But I feel very strongly that countering the Chinese military threat should not mean abandoning our our principles, and to do so, I think, is counterproductive in the long run. The Biden administration has framed tensions with China as a contest between democracy and autocracy, and I agree with that assessment. But that's why it's so vital that we don't undermine our own peace for democracy and open ourselves up to charges of hypocrisy by supporting one of the most brutal regimes in the world. The Philippines are also naturally pushing back against Chinese government encroachment out of their own self-interest, particularly given the ongoing territorial dispute with China in the South China Sea. Indeed, Duterte was initially set on deepening ties with China and moving away from the United States, that had to revert course as a result of Chinese aggressiveness. So in the long run, I believe that our nation, the United States, will be stronger and more secure if we stand by our principles, even when it's difficult, rather than abandon those democratic ideals.
Thank you so much.
That is our only question for today. And again, thank you all so much for joining this press conference. Thank you to Representative Susan Wild, to the community organizations that are here, and to our community members.
Group photo.
There's